Holroyd, the quote. He says, I came across Hugh Kingsmill's books at a public library when I was about 20. The first one I read was his Life of Frank Harris. I had never realised that a biography could be so witty, so subtly amusing. When young, Kingsmill had known Harris and greatly admired him. By sending him up in his narrative, he's sending himself up too. It's like one of Max Beerbohm's series of caricatures in which the old cell and the young cell confront each other. So Hugh Kingsmill has a lot to offer, and Brooke will tell us about his own experiences with him, knowing him, and about his books. So it's over to you, Brooke.
Thank you very much, Dudley, and for making the main points. But I will certainly come back to one of them, not the Frank Harris one, but the other one. And I admire the sort of optimism of the Brothers of Charthouse, who are always trying to get me to shut up, because I have a totally unmerited reputation of being a bit of a chatterbox, and particularly with anecdotes. And so to rule out anecdotes, I've written out a text. But before I start my text, I've got 3 anecdotes that have just come to mind. And in a sense, they give just a slight feel of the background. I will be saying that I like to think I'm literate, but not literary, and that will rapidly appear. But with regard to the anecdotes, my father, who was born in 1889 and died in 1949, just before his 60th year, and he died in the Downs Hospital, the General Hospital in Brighton. And I think the day before he died, his life was prolonged on overhearing two nurses discussing his condition at the end of the bed, and one said to the other, "He's holding on to life like grim death." And that greatly cheered him up. Somebody had asked him how he viewed, the prospect of life after death. And you must obviously realise 1949 was not long after the Second World War. And he said something to the effect that my feelings must be rather similar to those of an evacuee who has a reasonable confidence that arrangements have been made for him at the other end, but he would much sooner stay where he was. And the third one, which actually gives his relation to me in a rather graphic way, I think was about 13 years old, and he had been talking to my mother and my surviving sister. Some of you have met her, so you may understand the story a little bit. And he came into my bedroom after talking to the 2 women folk of the family. He let out a sigh and said, "You and I must stick together in this household. We won't survive separately." So from that background, this is some thoughts. I stress I like to think I'm literate but not literary. Earlier this year, a member of this reading group acquired a copy of the Penguin paperback, The Best of Hugh Kingsmill, by Michael Holroyd. The hardback was published in 1970, and on the cover of the paperback, that is a photo of Michael Holroyd, not Hugh Kingsmill. Several people have asked me that, so I thought I'd just put that in. And the brother, having looked at the book and being interested in it, and recalling that I, Kingsmill's son, was one of our brothers, the idea emerged of considering Kingsmill in September, and that I should introduce the discussion. Now, this group usually selects one book and all can read it. Given the qualified availability of the reading material of Kingsmill, and thanks to the very diligent efforts of our master, sufficient copies of Holroyd's book were located, thus enabling the members to read the same material. It's not the usual sort of material, one book. It is an anthology. So there are a number of slightly different emphases this evening. I have no pretensions whatsoever of being a literary savant. Literate, yes. Literary, no. I know my preferences and can give my reasons, but that is it. The real issue, it seems to me, or the first issue is this: we are dependent on Holroyd's selection. So the first question is, how good is it? I think it's very good. But does he do Kingsmill justice? What we can say is that Holroyd is recognised as a leading literary biographer of the last half-century. He was knighted for his contribution. His first biography was of Kingsmill. It was his second biography of Lytton Strachey, that brought him to the wider notice of the literary world. He was appointed the official biographer of Bernard Shaw. Now, here are two extracts from Holroyd's introduction, which indicate his favourable assessment of Kingsmill. And although Douglas already pointed to one, I'm going to repeat it. No, not at all. You've given me a cue here. Behind the big names of 20th century literature, there stands a shadow cabinet of writers waiting to take over once the wind of change has blown. The wind of change was a particular one of the concepts of my father sending up the political speeches. My own vote goes to Hugh Kingsmill as leader of this opposition. Kingsmill, who died in 1949, is remembered by the reading public more as an ebullient personality, a man of abounding wit and vitality, than as a serious critic, novelist and biographer, so that until recently his books have been in danger of becoming forgotten altogether. And it is true, as his literary executor, I get a request, because it's still in copyright until 2019, I get a request about every 2 years for something to be published, so it's pretty infrequent. In a moving and unusual memoir comprising an exchange of letters, it's called About Kingsmill by Malcolm Muggeridge and Hesketh Pearson. It's a wonderful book. It really captures something of him, but it's not what we're considering this evening. Two of Kingsmill's closest friends, Malcolm Muggeridge and Hesketh Pearson, brilliantly succeeded in recreating him as one of the most stimulating of companions, but they made little attempt to re-establish him as a clearly recognisable literary figure. To achieve that is the purpose of this anthology, to introduce a sample of his writing to many to whom he has hitherto been little more than a name, and to acquaint them with some of those excellences in his work that should delight the reasonable reader. Sorry, that's rather a long quotation, but that, picking up Douglas' point, I think it makes a fairly important point. But now some more sort of, some briefer references to what other writers' assessments of him. For 20 years, the literary standards that Kingsmill championed in the New English Review have been eclipsed by educationist critical systems whose control on taste and fashion has been paramount. Kingsmill himself belonged to no school of critics. He judged literature by its truthfulness and by its power to reveal individual truths through humour, pathos, tenderness. No one had a sharper eye than he for detecting humbug. The truth he searched for was the truth we live, not speak. Were we to give currency to his uncompromising values, there might well be a revolution in our present tastes and literary attitudes. And just one more brief quotation. His admirers seldom agree as to what is his finest book. Malcolm Muggeridge, I fancy, prefers his Frank Harris. Hesketh Pearson liked his The Return of William Shakespeare. And my own favourite, that is Holroyd's, is The Progress of a Biographer. In his recently published letters, George Orwell pronounced The Sentimental Journey to be the best biography of Dickens ever written. It has now been out of print for 30 years. He also reveals that he had made unsuccessful efforts to get After Puritanism reprinted. At least readers may see part of it here. And there's also a reference that since it is impossible to detach sections from his novels and expect them to perform in isolation the same function as in their original settings, his fiction, much admired by so professional a novelist as Graham Greene, is underrepresented. And I've given those quotations because I think that Holroyd's making some fairly important points there. From my own views, I have extracted the following 3 comments. Can everybody hear me all right?
Thank you.
Yeah, too well, yes, I think. From my overviews, I've extracted the following 3 comments. Here is a topical thought on Holroyd's idea of Kingsmill as leader of the literary opposition. Some say that Jeremy Corbyn's election as leader of the opposition might consign such opposition to oblivion. And it is true that Holroyd's shadow cabinet of the literary world never gained power and has currently disappeared from the scene. My second point is Holroyd's selection, presenting Kingsmill largely as a literary critic, needs to be put, this I think is a very important point, given this selection, needs to be put into the fuller context of Kingsmill's great love and very wide knowledge of English literature, from Chaucer through to Kingsmill's own day. For me, this is best illustrated in Kingsmill's The High Hill of the Muses, published posthumously in 1955. It's quite a big book, a wonderful book of Kingsmill's favourite passages from Chaucer through to the beginning of the 20th century. It is an anthology containing Kingsmill's favourite passages from English literature, with a 36-page introduction by himself. One of his contemporaries wrote that it once again reveals how acute and original he was as a critic, and there are constant flashes of that particular humour which so greatly endeared him to his friends. Included in his favourite passages, please note, included in his favourite passages are selections from Dickens and Thackeray. My third point is this, and it's a reference to this book by Richard Ingram's, former editor of Private Eye, called God's Apology. Richard Ingram's in God's Apology argues that Kingsmill's genius was for friendship and conversation. It is thought that many of Kingsmill's literary insights were voiced in these conversations, and that they subsequently appeared in the writings of his friends, their source not always acknowledged. Now, I have a view on this. It's highly contentious in my family and amongst his friends, but I just want to develop this point because I think it is important. I illustrate my view of this self-indulgently from a totally different context of much interest to me. A short walk from here brings one to New River Head on Rosebery Avenue. The New River is an early 17th century provision that made a significant improvement in London's water supply. The name mainly associated with it is Sir Hugh Middleton. Yet the genius who originated the concept, the source, the route, the 100-foot contour, the gradient, indeed the whole idea, was one Edmund Colthurst. I further indulged myself in a little exercise. Along the course of the New River, there are 2 streets named Colthurst and 10 at least named Middleton. The truth is, but for Colthurst's excellent concept, the New River would never have seen the light of day. Yet it is also true that without Middleton, it would never have become more than a short ditch in Hertfordshire. The genius Colthurst and the entrepreneur Middleton needed each other, as it applies to our subject this evening. Likewise, the thinker with perceptive insights needs his amanuensis. St. Paul used amanuenses. He even names one, Tertius. I have dwelt on this point somewhat. It is a much debated issue amongst Kingsmill's family and friends, who are rightly concerned to undervalue his writings. I'm on the next to last page, Duncan.
Oh dear, no.
Dudley, if I can continue. My own personal subjective preferences are mainly from the essays such as After Puritanism, The Progress of a Biographer, and The Poisoned Crown. Selections of all 3 are made by Holroyd. The Poisoned Crown, it's this book here, The Poisoned Crown, published in 1944, with its first essay entitled The Genealogy of Hitler, also appeared in a services edition. and in Spanish as La Corona Envenenada. I think from memory, I think I've got that title right. It's rather interesting, you know, that given the date 1944, with Hitler still around and Franco still around, that it appeared in a services edition and also in Spanish. These personal preferences tell you more about me than about Kingsmill, the subject of this evening's reading group. One brief reminiscence. I recall, probably inaccurately, Kingsmill telling us children before the Second World War how years earlier he had been walking with some friends. As they passed a butcher's shop, they saw a ham on a hook hanging in a window. Stuck into it was the notice, "Mild and cured." They reflected ruefully that such a desirable state could so easily be attainable by a humble ham, yet seemed to be impossibly unattainable by us human beings. The friends continued on their walk with great laughter. And to conclude, 2 lines, derived from that on page 380 here. But bacon's not the only thing that's cured by hanging from a string. I've got a number, when the conversation flags, 1 or 2 questions, but if I can leave it at that, Dudley.
Well, yes, that's wonderful. You've undoubtedly stirred us out.